time to make a return to PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 emulation, but this time around we're going to be reenacting the never-ending console wars between Xbox and PlayStation, Microsoft versus Sony, and relive the 7th generation battle between the PS3 and 360. These two consoles were in a very tight race, with the Xbox 360 dominating earlier in that generation and the PlayStation 3 gaining ground, eventually ending the generation as the winner with 87 million units sold versus the Xbox 360's 84 million units, highlighting just how competitive it was between the two iconic consoles. So let's fast forward to current times, and thanks to emulation and some powerful hardware, we will be pitting Xenia Canary against RPCS3 and put these two emulators head to head in an epic battle for 7th generation emulation supremacy. Please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we determine which emulator does it best and decide for one last time who really is the winner of the 7th generation of home consoles. As we always do, let's talk about our setup here and go over a few things. I will be using the ROG Ally as the test device for this showcase. I expect that similar results will be seen with the Ryzen 7 7840U based handhelds as well, since they are quite similar in performance. In addition, the Lenovo Legion Go is an upcoming handheld which should have the same Z1 Extreme processor. All games were tested with the 15-watt performance mode preset on the ROG Ally, and I will let you know if any games require less or more power on the Ally. For both RPCS3 and Xenia Canary, I am using the latest builds that were available to me at the time. I will be using footage captured directly, and I try my best to match up gameplay segments for a fair comparison. For whatever reason, I noticed that my capture card didn't like Xenia Canary, so it does occasionally introduce some weird stuttering, which is not present on the device itself. For every game in this video, I will be deciding on a winner in the battle, and then at the end we will tally up the results to determine which emulator does it better. This is purely meant for fun, and both emulators are truly amazing feats that allow us gamers to enjoy so much of the 7th generation on our x86 based devices. In addition, I will be detailing any specific settings needed to achieve similar results throughout the video. However, some tips will be based on the assumption that you've seen my two prior videos on RPCS3 and Xenia Canary emulation, which I definitely recommend checking out as they serve as great introductions to both emulators, complete with installation tips, settings, and more. Finally, it would mean a lot to me if you find this video and all my other videos helpful to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, which allows me to continue making in-depth videos like these. Your support is always appreciated. So with all of that out of the way, let's start out with some 50 Cent Blood on the Sand, and this game is actually a blast and well worth playing through. Blood on the Sand has never been released on any platforms outside of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and so in our first game in this battle, we have RPCS3 not quite able to manage 60 frames per second at 15 watts, and so it will definitely need to be taken up to that 25 watt turbo motor on the ROG Ally to stay consistently at 60 frames per second. Regardless, the game is quite playable, and for this one, Xenia Canary is pretty close up there in performance with RPCS3, but I'd say overall the PS3 version is the winner of this battle and the way to go here because of slightly better performance and less in-game issues. By the way, for Blood on the Sand, you will need to make sure you have patches enabled in Xenia Canary, and then go to the specific game patch and set the dynamic lighting and shadows shading fixed to true, the flickering decals fixed to true, the disable motion blur to true, and finally set 16x anisotropic filtering to true. I did cover Xenia Canary patches in my prior video mentioned earlier, and it is linked in the description below. Next, we've got another really cool game with great music and just fun hack and slash gameplay. Afro Samurai is very much a forgotten game and maybe not so well received critically, but I think it's a blast to play through. Performance between both RPCS3 and Xenia Canary is identical at 15 watts, staying consistently at 30 frames per second. However, I'm going to have to give this one yet again to PS3 version, as RPCS3 essentially plays this game without any issues. On Xenia Canary, the audio in-game can be a bit problematic, and so I think RPCS3 just wins this one out. Both versions do not require any specific changes to the settings. Anarchy Reigns is an awesome beat-em-up from Platinum Games and Sega, and it's another game that remains stuck on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The results of this one were very interesting, as there were regressions for both of the latest versions of RPCS3 and Xenia Canary, so both actually require older builds to get them to run properly, or at least better. For RPCS3, the game would crash, and on Xenia Canary, there were graphical glitches that impacted gameplay. No worries though, just check out the description area and I will have links to both of the builds that I used for Anarchy Reigns. They are both contained installs, which means you simply just need to extract the contents of the files to their own folder and run it from there. You do not need to install anything with those builds. And in a surprise twist, it appears that Xenia Canary will pull away with this win, as performance is better in Xenia Canary, staying closer to or at that 30 frames per second target. So Team Xbox comes away with this win for the first time in this video. Next up, we have Armored Core 5, and amazingly this is not the 5th entry in the franchise, but the 14th installment in the mainline Armored Core series. At first glance, it appears that both RPCS3 and Xenia Canary are running this game well, but unfortunately, you will notice that there are texture issues with the Xbox 360 version. Now to fix this, you need to enable the Direct 3D12 Reback Resolve and set this to true, as well as set Protect 0 to false. Unfortunately, the Direct 3D12 Reback Resolve setting does impact performance on the Xbox 360 version, and so the PlayStation 3 version will perform better in RPCS3, and it does look like this one is going to be going to Team PlayStation. Army of Two is a really cool series that got its start on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 with 2 additional sequels, and unfortunately the franchise has never been seen again. This is the first game in the franchise and it was never released on any other platform. For this one, you will notice that Xenia Canary has an issue with the bloom effect in the game, which causes the image to be very bright. The latest version of RPCS3 has the same issue, and there is a regression when setting the right color buffers to on, which is needed to fix the bloom issue. Unfortunately, in the latest version, it causes the image to flicker. However, an older build of RPCS3, in fact the one that I mentioned earlier, doesn't have the issue with the flickering image. As a result, I guess we're gonna have to give this one to Team PlayStation. Note that both games do run quite well, and you could argue that it's slightly more efficient using Xenia Canary. Asura's Wrath is another awesome Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 exclusive game from developer CyberConnect 2 and published by Capcom. I really can't believe we haven't seen this game return in some capacity, and just like every other game so far remains stuck on the 360 and PS3, never seeing a release anywhere else. For the first time in this video, RPCS3 and Xenia Canary both run this game without any major issues, without the need for specific builds, and you might think this one will end in a draw. However, I noticed something very interesting between the two emulators. For this game, I'm going to be giving the Xbox team their second win, as Xenia Canary seems to be much more efficient at running this game using less power, which at times is almost as much as 5 watts less, and so I think that's a fair way to decide the winner here. There was a time when we got a game with every Marvel movie release, and something that I do miss a little bit, as a lot of these movie tie-ins were actually not bad at all, and Captain America Super Soldier, as you might have expected, is based on the first Avenger film. This game is pretty decent and even has all of the actors reprise their roles. There were a few versions of this game, but it was never released on PC, and so let's talk about the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions here. This one turned out some interesting results at 15 watts. Neither game is free of their own issues. For RPCS3, the game does have trouble staying at a consistent frame rate, but despite that is incredibly playable. For Xenia Canary, I had to make a config line change for the GPU allow invalid fetch constants and set it to true. Otherwise, you will end up with pink screens making the game unplayable. For whatever reason, Xenia Canary is rendering this game as a dark image, and even with turning the brightness way up, we still have an image that is way darker than the PlayStation 3 version on the left. Xenia Canary does a better job maintaining higher frame rates, However, I do think I'm going to have to give this one to the PlayStation team.
Hold the line! Show them what we're made of!
We need to be a bit more hands-on.
Dante's Inferno is actually a game I've talked about before, but I don't believe I've ever shown the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions. Instead, I have featured the really solid PlayStation Portable port. Now, outside of those platforms, this game has never been seen again and did not receive a PC port. This one comes to us from Visceral Games, the studio behind the original Dead Space trilogy, and is a fantastic original game from Electronic Arts. This is yet another game I wish would make a return in some capacity, and is another game that doesn't have much issue running at 15 watts with both RPCS3 and Xenia Canary not requiring anything specific to get it to run the way you see here. In fact, both emulators run this game at a full 60 frames per second, and is one that essentially runs great regardless of platform. Now, I want to award a winner, so I will go based on some of the performance numbers that I'm seeing here, and again, this is just more for fun, but I will have to give this one to the PlayStation team again, as it does appear to require less resources running both the GPU and CPU at lower frequencies, resulting in a slightly less power draw versus the Xbox 360 version with Xenia Canary. The Darkness is a first-person shooter game based on the comic book series, and this was developed by Starbreeze, better known more recently for the Payday franchise. This is another great game that regrettably has never been revisited. There was a sequel release that made it to PC, but the original never received a PC version, and so we have yet again another 360 and PS3 exclusive. I think this is about the closest call yet, and both RPCS3 and Xenia Canary handle this game extremely well. For RPCS3, you will need to turn strict rendering to on. Over on Xenia Canary, you will need to go into the darkness patch that is available and make sure the bright lighting fix patch is set to true for the is enabled value. Again, you will need to make sure you have patches enabled in the Xenia Canary config and download the patches file from the Xenia Canary GitHub, which is all explained in my Xenia Canary video for the ROG Ally. This one is almost too close to call, but you know what, why not? I'll give it to Team Xbox simply because back in the day, the Xbox 360 version was the one to play over the PS3 version. And so, that's another point for Team Xbox.
Thanks, Mikey.
Attaboy, Jackie. You look after those pieces and use them well. This looks real bad. Real bad.
Enchanted Arms comes to us from the legends over at From Software, and this is a straight-up traditional turn-based JRPG. This was actually published by Ubisoft for release outside of Japan, and first was released on Xbox 360 and then received a PlayStation 3 port a year later. Enchanted Arms performs quite well on both RPCS3 and Xenia Canary, and this is running at 10 watts for both emulators. I'd say the slight advantage goes to RPCS3 as the framerate is a consistent 30 frames per second and doesn't seem to dip at any point, whereas Xenia Canary does have much more frequent frame drops, though nothing too problematic. So it does look like it's another win for Team PlayStation and RPCS3. Next up, we have another Japanese RPG. Eternal Sonata comes to us from Bandai Namco Games. The game has an interesting premise based on Polish pianist Frédéric Chopin and features several of his pieces. I've always thought this was a solid game and especially liked the visual style. This was another game that was released on Xbox 360 first and then received a PlayStation 3 port a year later, which is considered the complete version. Just like Enchanted Arms, I have this game running at 10 watts on both RPCS3 and Xenia Canary, and Eternal Sonata does quite well with that preset. This was another extremely close one with RPCS3 just barely edging out Xenia Canary with slightly more consistent frame rates. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to go with Team PlayStation on this one.
I'll do my best. Orange glow!
EA's Fight Night series of boxing games is quite the popular franchise, and this one was a specific request by one of my viewers, and so I wanted to save this one since I knew I had plans for this RPCS3 and Xenia Canary battle. Fight Night Round 4 is exclusive to the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, never receiving a PC port. Oddly enough, it did receive a mobile version for Windows Mobile and the BlackBerry. Go figure. Round 4 features a pretty iconic roster of fighters including Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson. This was another close battle as both emulators run this game quite well without major issues and solid performance with no special tweaks or builds needed. I think I will give this one to the Xbox team as Fight Night does stay completely locked to 60 frames per second on Xenia Canary, whereas RPCS3 is just slightly below that at the 15-watt preset. It's kind of amazing how many interesting new properties came out during the PlayStation 3 and 360 generation. Fracture is another forgotten gem developed by Day One Studios and published by LucasArts, both of which should definitely date this game. Fracture is a third-person shooter that allows you to manipulate your environment by deforming the terrain. It's a pretty interesting game, and while it certainly didn't win any awards, I found it to be quite enjoyable back in the day. This is another example of both emulators running the game quite well, but you will notice that RPCS3 does have some issues rendering in-game. I did try a few fixes as well as an older build to see if I could correct the problem, but unfortunately it was still present. Therefore, I'm going to have to give this one to the Xbox team, as Xenia Canary provides similar performance but with less issues in-game. I wonder if Team Xbox is starting to close the gap.
User and trencher to shield him from the gunfire. Build cover to get him out of there.
And no surprise, we have another game that remains stuck on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Lollipop Chainsaw is a great hack and slash game from Grasshopper Manufacture and comes to us from the crazy mind of Suda51, who is also responsible for the No More Heroes franchise. Yet again, we have a game that works really well with both Xenia Canary and RPCS3 and is another close call. However, in my own personal testing of Lollipop Chainsaw with Xenia Canary, I did experience times when the audio would cut out, mostly during cutscenes, and so because of that issue, I will be giving this one to the PlayStation team, but really this is impressive on both emulators. By the way, I did need to enable the right color buffers option in RPCS3. Majin and the Forsaken Kingdom comes to us from Namco Bandai Games and Game Republic, the same studio responsible for games like Folklore and Genji. Unfortunately, the studio is no longer around and mostly forgotten, just like this hidden gem of a game. It's kind of amazing how many original and interesting games were released during this generation, and I was pleasantly surprised by how many of these overlooked gems there were in the 7th generation. Majin is an action platformer game with some interesting puzzle elements. For this game, I actually turned the TDP down to 10 watts as it seemed to be a less demanding game to run. However, RPCS3 definitely handles it better at that 10 watt TDP versus Xenia Canary, which is struggling a bit to maintain that 30 frames per second target. As a result, I will have to side yet again with RPCS3 since we are able to run this at a lower TDP, which is definitely a necessity for those of us gaming on handhelds to conserve battery life as much as possible. I'm pretty sure this is going to be one of the more popular games in this video, and for good reason. The Midnight Club franchise from Rockstar Games has always been a very fun and solid racing game franchise, and this entry, Midnight Club Los Angeles, is the 4th installment in the Midnight Club series. Interestingly, the size of LA in this game is equivalent to all 3 prior games combined. There was a very solid PSP port of this game released, but outside of that, this one for whatever reason didn't receive a PC port and hasn't been seen anywhere else. It's sadly the last game in the Midnight Club franchise, and it's been close to 15 years since the last game. I found this one to be a fun one to compare since there's some interesting things happening here. Now we are definitely going to need to turn the TDP up for this one as it's quite a demanding game to emulate. I have the ROG Ally set to the 25 watt turbo mode, and you will notice that Xenia Canary is actually doing a better job maintaining higher frame rates than the PS3 version in RPCS3. Additionally, both games exhibit differences in how it is rendered in-game, which I found to be interesting. Overall, however, I do think Xenia Canary is doing a better job with this one, as RPCS3 never really reaches that 30 frames per second target. Therefore, I will say that Team Xbox gets this win. Finally, RPCS3 does need a few settings changed which are detailed on screen, while Xenia Canary did not require any specific tweaks. NCAA Football makes this video mostly in honor of Aish from Retro Handhelds, which by the way is a great Discord community discussing all kinds of retro handhelds, including a channel dedicated to the ROG Ally. You can also come over and chat with me in my own dedicated channel, but mostly it's just a great place to hang out and talk games. NCAA Football 14 is actually a pretty significant entry, as it's the last installment in the NCAA Football franchise and is the last time we've seen a college-based football game. The game is quite popular and actually receives unofficial roster updates every season from the community in the form of College Football Revamped, which I will have a link to the GitHub page in the description. All of this obviously makes NCAA 14 a very popular game to emulate. Unfortunately, Xenia Canary cannot emulate this game properly, and so the automatic win does go to Team PlayStation. For RPCS3, this one was a bit unique. I had to go into settings and first change the shader mode to async with shader interpreter and let the shaders compile a bit just by going through and trying to play the game. Once you've done that a bit, you can go back and change the setting back to default or just use the boot with default configuration option, and it should be a mostly smooth experience after that.
And he'll return this one from the 7. And down he goes, the 27-yard line.
And of course, here's another heavy hitter for the emulation scene. Red Dead Redemption, as many know, never received a PC port, and even now with it finally making its way to other platforms, still has not been given a proper PC port. And in a surprise battle, we have a new challenger, as Red Dead Redemption is now on Nintendo Switch, which means it can be emulated with Yuzu. And so let's put the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Nintendo Switch versions against each other in this mega console war battle between the three giants of the gaming industry. I have the Ally set to the 25-watt turbo mode for all three of these tests. All of these tests were conducted at the game's native resolution. I will say that I was very impressed by Yuzu's performance this early on, and it should only get better as optimizations are made for the game specifically. Between all three here, I'd still say that overall, Xenia Canary is the way to go, as this version has the least amount of issues and has the best performance overall. You will notice that the game is exhibiting some graphical issues in Yuzu, while in RPCS3, performance is lagging behind both Yuzu and Xenia even when not doing shader compilation. And so in this three-way battle, Xenia Canary wins out, and for the purposes of this video, Xbox team comes away with a win. Finally, I will put on screen the settings that I am using for RPCS3 to run Red Dead Redemption as you see in the footage. You will probably want to grab a drink when first launching the game, as it does have a bit longer than usual PPU compiling times, but will be much faster at subsequent launches.
Now back up, Mr. Martin. The sooner we get to the fort, the better.
Let's go.
Are you planning on spending any time in Armadillo, Mr. Marston?
I doubt it. I ain't planning on staying very long.
Well, if you're fixing for some female...
We've got another Grasshopper manufacturer and Suda51 game here, and surprisingly this one was published by Electronic Arts. Shadows of the Damned was also produced by Shinji Mikami of Resident Evil fame, as well as having music composed by Akira Yamaoka of Silent Hill fame. This game has an A-tier list of people involved in the project. Just like most of Grasshopper games, this is another cult classic that sold extremely poorly. Apparently a remaster is in the works, which was recently announced. However, no need to wait for that, as we can enjoy it right here with RPCS3 and Xenia Canary. This game isn't too demanding surprisingly, and I have the Ally set to use a 10-watt silent mode preset, and while results are pretty close, I think that the PS3 version in RPCS3 fares better overall, with a much more consistent experience at only 10 watts. That's not to say that Xenia Canary isn't able to run this full speed with a little bit more power. However, there are a few in-game issues in Xenia that aren't present in RPCS3. So I think it's pretty clear that PlayStation team notches themselves another win. Here's another really interesting entry. Silent Hill Downpour, the follow-up to Silent Hill Homecoming, is definitely a game I don't hear much about anymore and was developed by Vatra Games, a studio based out of the Czech Republic and the only Silent Hill game that they developed. Silent Hill Downpour stays closer to the series' roots with a focus on atmosphere and story. For this test, I have set the Ally to 10 watts again, as this is another game that isn't too demanding. However, that holds true more so for RPCS3, with the PlayStation 3 version staying consistently locked at its target of 30 frames per second using just 10 watts. Whereas for Xenia Canary, it is definitely struggling to keep those frames up and will require just a bit more power to be on parity with RPCS3. In addition, Xenia Canary has a few in-game issues with the graphics that seem to be a regression from much older builds, with the wireframes visible on some character models. It looks like the PlayStation team has another win with this one, and performance in RPCS3 is just incredible. I always get excited when we can emulate heavier PS3 games using such a low amount of power.
Open the goddamn door! Help somebody! This is a violation of my rights. Who the hell do you think you are? When I talk to the warden,
No one's listening.
Help! Jesus, help me!
Skate 3 is easily one of the most high-profile games from a series that EA has decided to ignore forever. Apparently, Skate 4 has been in development for a couple of years now, but until then, Skate 3 is a great option and really served as the benchmark for PlayStation 3 emulation for many years. In fact, I can't believe how far we've come with this game, and just in terms of performance, it's pretty amazing that nowadays we are able to enjoy this game on a low-watt APU and handheld device. Not only that, but emulation is equally good in both Xenia Canary and RPCS3. In fact, I think this is the closest I have seen yet in terms of performance between the two. Now, I hate to do this to the Xbox team, but I think I will have to give it to PlayStation just on a slight advantage, as I do think it's just a bit smoother overall. Now, I do have the Ally set to 25 watts, but you can definitely turn it down a little bit and it should still perform quite well. For RPCS3, you only need to change one setting, which is enabling the right color buffers option. Despite its title, Soul Calibur V is the 6th main entry in the Soul Calibur series and probably doesn't need much of an introduction, being a long-running fighting game franchise. You probably have already noticed, but unfortunately Xenia Canary doesn't work with Soul Calibur V. Now, I really wanted to feature one of the Soul Calibur games, and so I went back and checked out Soul Calibur 4, which unfortunately is also not working with Xenia Canary, and so RPCS3 notches itself another win with the Soul Calibur games by default. Splatterhouse is a reboot and a reimagining of the original Splatterhouse released way back in 1988. This reboot remains stuck on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 and was received with mixed reviews, but I think it's still a fun playthrough with pretty cool music, graphics, and voice acting. It's definitely got plenty of gore with splatter kills that are specifically finishing moves emphasizing the gory elements. For this test, I decided to set the Ally to 10 watts as I noticed performance was quite good at 15 watts. However, while RPCS3 is doing very well at 10 watts, maintaining close to that 30 frames per second target, unfortunately Xenia Canary is falling behind and is unable to keep up with RPCS3. So for this battle, I will be awarding the PlayStation team with another win, as this is quite a good performer at lower TDP. SSX served as the reboot of the series and unfortunately remains the last time we have seen this awesome snowboarding franchise from EA Sports, and a bit surprising as it did quite well. It's a real shame that EA gave up on SSX because EA Canada did a great job with this reboot for the 7th generation consoles. This one actually uses real locations unlike the fictional ones from the prior entries. Now, comparing the two emulators, and it's clear that Xenia Canary is running this one at the target frame rate of 30 frames per second consistently compared to RPCS3 using just 15 watts. It's definitely a nice turnaround from the Splatterhouse results, and so for this one we will be giving it to the Xbox team. Tekken Tag Tournament 2, just like Soul Calibur earlier on the list, is another long-running fighting game franchise, and Tekken Tag 2 marks the 8th installment in the Tekken franchise. This game did receive a port to the Wii U, and so you can emulate that version as well with Simu. However, there won't be any surprise challengers here, and we will just stick to the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions. For this one, I have the Ally set to 10 watts since the game is a little bit less demanding, and as we can see here, the PlayStation 3 version is performing a lot better at 10 watts, mostly staying at that full 60 frames per second once most of the shader compilation is finished. Xenia Canary can handle this game, but just requires more power to do so, and therefore, this one will be going to the PlayStation team. Thor God of Thunder is our second Marvel game for this video, and again we saw a lot of video game tie-ins with earlier Marvel movies. Thor God of Thunder, interestingly, is the first time Thor appears in his own standalone video game, and just like Captain America, features all the actors reprising their roles for the voice acting and likeness. This one was released on multiple platforms but never received a PC port, and so we will take a look at the 7th generation versions here. Both emulators handle the game quite well. I did notice some graphical issues in Xenia Canary, but really nothing game breaking, and some of the stuttering you see in the footage is just my capture card acting up outside of the actual frame drops that you see in the video. I do think that overall RPCS3 handles the game a bit smoother with less frame drops, as well as needing a bit less power if you pay attention to the clock speeds on display. Therefore, I do think I will have to give this one to the PlayStation team yet again. Next up, we have the 5th installment in the Virtua Fighter series. I don't think there's much to say about this iconic fighting game franchise from Sega and Sega AM2. Virtua Fighter 5 has never received a PC port, but did recently receive a port to the PlayStation 4 as Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown. Here we have another test of the 10-watt emulation capabilities of the ROG Ally, and you will notice on the Xenia Canary side that it appears to be running in slow motion. Unfortunately, it is running at about half the speed of RPCS3 at the 10-watt preset. Now, this game targets a frame rate of 60, and it's clear that RPCS3 isn't having much issues staying at that target. It's going to be yet again another win for the PlayStation team. Finally, we are now at our last game in this console war, and if you've been taking score, this one will not be any kind of tiebreaker. Wet comes to us from Bethesda Softworks, an artificial-minded movement better known for the Dead by Daylight series. I have always enjoyed this game, and the main character is actually voiced by Eliza Dushku. This is a pretty slick third-person shooter game and never received a PC port, as well as never leaving the Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3. There was actually a PSP port planned, but it was eventually cancelled. And of course, we end this entire video with probably the closest comparison between the two emulators. I found that Wet ran a lot better using 25 watts on the Ally, as it is a fairly demanding game with a lot of action happening on screen. It was actually quite difficult to really determine which should win this portion, and you know what, I'm feeling a bit generous here, and so the Xbox team can take this one to wrap up our showcase. And speaking of, I think it's the perfect time to do just that. It's pretty obvious that without providing the actual numbers, which emulator is the winner here. But after tallying up all of the numbers, and out of the 28 games that were tested, Xenia Canary comes away with 9 total wins, versus RPCS3's dominating 19 wins, and so it does look like RPCS3 is the way to go for the most part when it comes to enjoying multi-platform games on PC with emulation. It's a bit ironic, as back in the day many preferred the Xbox 360 versions of multi-platform games, as they oftentimes ran better, looked better, and even had exclusive content. At the end of the day, just as I mentioned when we first started this video out, we as gamers come away as the winners of this, since we are truly able to enjoy these great games that otherwise would remain locked away in the 7th generation and potentially lost to time. Let me know what you thought of this video. Your input and comments help my channel grow, and I always enjoy reading and responding to the comments. Thank you all for the support, and please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. As always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.